Welcome to Throwaway Society, where we find things in the trash and we attempt to fix them. Now, we're not always going to be successful, but we're going to give it a shot. And today's victim here is a Staples SPL-TXC18A. It's an 18-sheet cross-cut shredder that shreds credit cards, CDs, DVDs, and staples. It shreds 7 feet per minute, and it has a 10-minute continuous runtime and a 7-gallon wastebasket here. So as I'm turning the switch on, when I first found it, there's no power at all to it. So we're going to get it up on the workbench and see if we can't figure out what's going on with it. Okay, so we flipped it over. All the screws are out. You're going to end up with a bunch of these little screws. There's probably about maybe 10 of them. So let's open this up and see what it looks like. Oh man, that's as expected. It's going to have some dirt in it. Here's the motor. The motor isn't seized. The motor's turning. It is turning the blades. There is some electronics here. Now, I did, when I first got it, there's a power button on the back of it, a switch, and I do hear like a relay. So it is getting power. That's a good sign that this is turning. I think the first step, what we're going to do is get it outside with the air compressor, clean it up a little bit, then we'll bring it back in and get a better look at this stuff, and hopefully we can figure out why it's not working. If it doesn't work, it was garbage to begin with, not a big deal, but we'll give it a shot. Okay, so let's blow this thing out. See what we get. Let's clean it up a little. Okay, so we have the cover off, and I did take some of the wiring off. Basically, there's some screws that are going all around the outside. You can see the motor here. It looks much cleaner. It's a lot easier to work on. We are moving the motor manually here, so the motor's not seized up. That's a good sign. And you can see as I move it, you can see the shredder blades moving. We've got some gears here. So that's moving. That's a good sign. We do have the cover here, and there is a control board on it. Now let's get a closer look here at the control board. If you have a couple relays here, we have some interference suppression capacitors here. The motor was hooked up here. This connector here, and you have various interfaces here where the sensors hook up. You'll see 2 sensors here, and these sensors are for when the paper is put in, and then the machine automatically comes on. We have our power switch here in the back. Let's see what else here. So I don't smell anything on the motor. I do smell something on the board here. There was a smell on there. Now there is a fuse here. We can test that fuse out. I do see some brown. I don't know if you can see that. It's a little browning around those resistors. But let's get the tester out and let's take a look at it and see what we can come up with. Okay, so we have our multimeter here set up, and we're just going to put it on continuity, and just to make sure the meter is working properly, we touch these two together. If you notice there, we have 0. That indicates that we have a connection. So we'll first take a look at this fuse here. It's right on the board here. It's not a removable fuse. Look like you would have to desolder that. So we put it on each side of the connection here. And you can see we have some continuity there. So that looks good. But I am concerned about the browning here on the board. But it's not the end of the road yet. Let's think about what this board really does. You know, it's mainly sensors for the paper. You have some lights that light up on the front on the top cover. It's going to tell you when the bin is full, which I can clearly see if the bin is full. And it also controls reverse. Now I'm going to be using this if it does work for, you know, it shreds a bunch of papers at once, and it's mainly made for I think it was like close to $200 new. So this is probably from around 2011, 2012. You know, mainly designed for probably like a small business. You know, I wouldn't be shredding that many papers at once. Usually I'm just shredding things from the, you know, credit card offers I get in the mail and things like that. So as long as you kept it, you know, light duty and you didn't shove a bunch of things in it, I'm sure it would work just fine. Especially knowing the fact that it was thrown out in the trash. Maybe we can get some use out of it. So I think I'm going to start with checking the other components out, and we'll start with the motor. We'll check the motor out, and let's see if we get anything from the motor and make sure that that works, and then we'll go around and check the other components. So let's do that now. Okay, so I think we're going to test this motor out and just see if it's any good. Now I've seen these motors online. You know, they have a bunch of parts for these. I do not see the boards. Now I'm guessing because I've had boards that were bad before. You know, the board pretty much is the heart of everything. You know, it's controlling when the motor comes on, it's controlling, you know, when it senses the paper. Those are features that we, you know, if we have to do without and can make it work, you know, I could probably run it from the switch and just have it come on if that's shot. Because our goal here is just we don't want to put any money into this. I'm guessing the board's probably $100. The motor itself is $100, and I've seen it for $115. You have a capacitor here, a run capacitor. You know, you're talking $55 there. You know, everything mechanically is good. You know, the motor isn't seized up. So what I'm going to do is take these alligator clips here. I'm going to get the power cord, and I've cut away a few of these wires so I can tap into them. Now I could have tapped into the end of the connector here. In fact, I could have just cut the whole connector off, but we don't want to do that yet. So I'm using the razor blade to cut off some of the sheathing of the wire. Now good practice is, you know, so these don't arc against each other, is I'm going to cut the next wire I'm going to test up a little higher. So you'll notice I've cut away sheathing on this wire here, and this one I went a little bit higher. Now if I had another wire I wanted to strip, maybe I'd go a little bit lower than this. Now that just reduces the risk of you grounding out these wires together while you're testing them. So we're going to get the power cord here. First I'm going to hook up, we'll start with black, maybe we'll go with white. Now I would normally use my 12 volt tester, but I don't think that's going to be enough juice to really see if this thing is going to work here. And I have the white wire here. So I've got my alligator clips hooked up, and I'm going to keep them as far away from each other as I can here. And grab the power cord. Here's our power cord here. Now you can always do, I don't know if you've seen my first video, but we can do a test on the power cord as well, just to make sure it's not an issue with the power cord. What I would typically do is just take one of your wires from the power cord and wrap it around one of the leads on your tester. And we'll bring this tester over here. And then when I touch a part of the plug, you'll see that I'm getting 0 there on the multimeter. So I've got a good connection on the one end of the plug. So now I'll do the same thing with the other side. And then I'll test the other side of the plug, and that's 0. So I know the plug's good. So we'll put this away and we'll get on to hooking up the power to it. Now, I don't recommend doing this if you don't know what you're doing. If you're afraid of electricity, but it's fine. You know, the worst that's going to happen, you know, if the motor was bad or shorted out, is you might trip a breaker. You know, it's not going to blow up. You know, if it was nice outside, and if I was worried about it, I would probably test things outside, you know, run an extension cord out there, but you know, the chances of it blowing up, it's just slim. You know, it's going to trip. That's what breakers and fuses are for. So we're going to go ahead. We have our alligator clips hooked up directly to the motor here on the black and white wire, and we're going to just hook up the alligator clips here at the other end. And then we're going to plug it in and be ready to unplug it real quick if we need to. So here I am. I'm going to have my extension cord here, and I have the plug. So let's go ahead and plug it in and see what happens. Okay, so I do see the motor's turning, but do you see how it's struggling? See, I have to give it a little push. Now that's what the start capacitor does. The start capacitor gives it enough juice to get the motor running. And there's all kinds of different capacitors. This one's a 40 UF capacitor. So we know the motor's turning. You know, obviously it's not running at full speed. And the reason for that is because we have to incorporate this capacitor into it. That's what gives it the burst of power to get it running. Okay. As I said, there's all kinds of different capacitors. You know, there's round ones. You have little tiny capacitors. Ceiling fans have capacitors. You know, your furnace has a capacitor to get the motor running. Now, my last video when I did the shop vac, that did not have a capacitor, probably because it's a smaller motor, just didn't require a capacitor. So we've done the preliminary test here, and we know that that's turning. So let's move on to the next step, and see if we can get some clues from where this connector here plugged into the board of how this run capacitor is wired in there. Okay, so we have the wires. There's two wires from the capacitor that's inside there. It's a square capacitor. I don't know if you can see it right inside there. It's a square capacitor, and it's basically like a kind of like a battery, but the thing with a capacitor is it'll store the charge and it'll release it, and that's what gives the burst of energy, enough to get the motor going. So we're going to test this capacitor first. And how you discharge a capacitor is you'll have two wires, or in the case of this type of capacitor, you have where it would go onto a board. You have these two pins here. That's where it would solder into the board. You know, you could take a screwdriver. You know, you could take a screwdriver and touch these two together like that, and that'll discharge the capacitor. And then by testing it, we'll use continuity. It's actually going to put voltage into it, and then we'll be able to switch it to voltage on the meter, and we'll see some voltage in there, and it should start dropping slowly. So we're going to do that. First we'll discharge this capacitor. We're going to hold these wires together for, you know, it doesn't take that long, and we'll put our test leads on. Now we'll bring over our meter. There's our meter. Let's see if I can get a better, that's kind of better view there. I'm putting on continuity here. And this tester has a 9-volt battery in it. So when I do this, I'm going to connect this here to one wire, and then I'll connect the other lead to the other wire. Okay, that's put a little voltage into it. Now we're going to switch it, and we'll go to the lowest AC setting here. Now I'll hook it up. Now do you see that? Do you see how the meter's dropping? That's actually the charge that I had put into the capacitor just now by doing the continuity, and it is dropping like it should. And that'll just keep dropping. So I know the capacitor's good. Okay, that's a basic test that you can do to test the capacitor. So that looks good. So let's move on to our next step, and let's find out what we can do here to make this thing work. Now we might have to bypass the board. You know, I don't need the board. I just want to make it work. We want to save this thing. We want to make it useful. We have a switch that works. We have a capacitor and the motor. It's really just the heart of the whole thing. Of course, you have the shredding blades in there and the gears. You know, everything's turning smoothly. So let's look at that control board, and we'll do some testing on there, and maybe we can get an idea of where these wires hook up in relation to the board, and then we'll manually hook the wires together, bypassing the board, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so here we have the control board, and we have, this is the motor. I don't know if you can see it, it says very small motor. This is where the motor hooked up. It would plug in right here. So what I'd like to do is to get an idea of where the capacitor, which wires the capacitor was hooked to. We can do some continuity testing here. We can do some continuity testing on these terminals. and see if any of them, okay, so 2 and 3 there show 0. So that tells me that the wires on this connector 2 and 3 are actually connected together through this board. 1 and 2 I don't get anything. 2 and 3 I'm getting some continuity there. 3 and 4 we don't get anything. 4 and 5 we have 0. Okay, sorry about that. I just had a cough. I didn't want to cough on the camera here. So we have 1 and 2, no continuity. 2 and 3, we have a connection there. 3 and 4, there's no connection. And 4 and 5, we have a connection. So if we look at this, let me move this away here. That just kind of gives me a little bit of clue of how it was hooked up. So now I can take, and you can see here is the wires here where the capacitor was hooked into. So making a list here, we have the connector, and we have 1 is white, 2 is gray, 3 is the run capacitor, 4 is the run capacitor, and 5 is black. And we know that 2 and 3 are creating a connection within this connector. So that would be the gray and the run cap, and then 4 and 5 would be the run cap and black. So now that we know that, let's go ahead and wire this thing up here manually. We'll still leave the connector on here. We'll just wire it through here with the clips and apply some power, and hopefully we'll get something out of it. It's a good thing to write everything down. I like to write everything down. So let's do that. I'm going to get a few things together, and we'll be back and see if we can get this thing working. Okay, so I have my one wire from the capacitor going to the black. I have the other wire from the capacitor going to the gray, and I've hooked up these alligator clips. One is to the white and one is to the gray and black, and we're going to do the same test here with the power cord. I'm going to hook up my alligator clips here to the power cord, and just try to keep these separate. Try to keep them separated. We'll set that aside and we'll give this thing a shot and see if we can see if the motor turns here. Okay, we have those hooked up. You know, it's a little bit messy looking with all the wires, but we'll clean it up. We're just testing it right now. Let me switch this wire around. Okay, I think we got a pretty good connection there. So there's basically what we have. We have the alligator clips which go to the power cord, which are tied in to the capacitor, and the power wires to the motor. And so we're going to try to plug this in here again. We're going to be very quick to unplug it if we see any sparks or anything. So let's give this a shot. That looks good. Now, did you notice the difference between the power of the motor from before when we just hooked up the power to the wires? We didn't have the capacitor, the start run capacitor, incorporated into the equation. So we had to give the motor a little push. Well, that's similar to when you have a ceiling fan and you hear it humming, and you can actually manually try to turn the fan, and if the fan starts moving, then you know it's the capacitor. So that's what makes the motor turn and start and kind of gives it a push. Like I said, they're used in a lot of things, so I'm real happy about that. We have it working now. The gears are turning. I wouldn't stick my hand in there. So the gears are turning and the motor's turning, and that looks good. So I think what I'm going to do here is I have a choice at this point. I can try to find this board, which I tried to find this board, and it's not out there. I think this model is, like I said, 2011, 2012, and if the board was available, it would be probably $100. It would probably exceed the price of the thing. Like I said, the motor alone is $115. The capacitor is $55. I'm not concerned with the bells and whistles of, when I put the paper in, it comes on automatically. That's great. I can use the switch, which it already has a switch here, so we can incorporate that switch to where when we turn the switch on, it comes on. What else? I don't need the bin sensor because it's clear on the front of it. I can clearly see if it's full of shred that I have to empty it. I don't need that. There's another switch on the bottom here, which is a switch that is activated when the bin is slid into the machine. Okay, now that's another thing I really don't need because I know when the bin is straight in or not. So those are all kind of bells and whistle things. I have another shredder that just has a on-off button. Doesn't have anything fancy. There's no lights on it. I don't need any of that stuff. We just want to shred some paper. So let's see if we can't get this switch incorporated in here, and we'll do some soldering of some wires, get the switch in there, and see if we can't bring this thing back to life and shred some paper with it without putting any money into it. That's really the goal. We don't want to put any money into it. It was found in the trash. We can make it work. Even if we have to do a professor from Gilligan's Island on it, that's what we're going to do. So hang in there, and let's go down to the next step and get this thing shredding some paper. Okay, so I've done some wiring here. You can see the switch. There's two wires that come from the switch, and what I've done is I've hooked one of those wires directly to the power cord, and it runs through the switch, and the other wire here is hooked to the white, and then we have the capacitor is hooked up here to the gray wire, and the other capacitor wire hooked to the black. So we're just going to try to incorporate the switch to turn it off and on instead of relying on the sensor that senses when the paper is inside. So we're just bypassing it. Okay, so we'll try the switch. Okay, so that appears to be working well. Now the only thing that with wiring it this way is you're not going to have the reverse. Now you can do some trickery and reverse the wiring and put reverse on there. As I said, for me, I'm not worried about it. I might leave the top loose where I can just manually turn this backwards. You can see when I do that, I can turn it either way I want to. Usually when you have a paper jam or something like that, it's going to occur around halfway when the paper's in there, and it doesn't take long to put it in reverse and get the paper out. You know, that's never happened to me. I'm not going to overload it. I think what I say, this is an 18-16 sheet. You know, I might just put 6 sheets of paper in. You know, I'm not going to be shredding and, you know, dumping a pile of CDs into it. You know, I'll basically just see how it goes. You know, if I run into some issues to where it's getting clogged up all the time, then I'll address the reversing issue. You know, it might take another switch that I'll have to put in to reverse the motor, but basically you're just reversing the polarity, which would cause the motor to go in the opposite direction. So I think at this point, since I know it's working, I'm going to go ahead and do some soldering and solder these wires together. I won't bother removing the connector. I'll just leave it on there and we'll stuff it in there. You know, or I could cut off these wires completely. You know, whatever is I'm going to be neat about it. Just as long as you're neat about it. You know, there is some space here on the left side here of the shredder where you can tuck wires in. You know, it's not going to hurt anything. So let's do that, and we'll get this thing back together and see if we can shred a piece of paper. Sounds like fun, right? Okay, so we have our soldering iron heating up here, and just to recap the wires, we have the power switch, the already existing power switch. One of the wires from the power switch goes to one of the wires on the power cord. Okay, we have the wire coming out of the switch that goes to the white wire for the motor, and we have our run capacitor, start capacitor. We have one of the wires from the capacitor going into the black wire to the motor, and we have the other wire from the capacitor going into the gray and to the other side of the power cord. So there's our power cord setup. Get my list here. So this is basically what we have there. Power to white, power to gray with one run cap wire, and the other run cap wire goes to the black. So we're going to go ahead and put some flux on these. I decided to cut the connector off. You know, I figure I'll just save it, and I was thinking maybe in the future if I came across a board or something, but again, I don't want to, you know, the idea is just to make this work and make it useful without putting any money into it. I mean, we did find it in the trash. So we're going to go ahead and just solder these wires together. So I'm going to just take some of this flux and put a little bit on each of these connections here. It's not the best flux in the world. I've had this for a while. I need some new flux actually. But there's enough left in here. It's kind of messy looking. It's kind of like a paste. But it does last. So we got that. I think all the wires are covered here. So we'll go ahead and get some solder here. And I like cutting it off of the roll. It's just easier to work with than holding that roll there. And we'll put a little bit on the tip. And there's one. I just keep putting it on the tip here. There's two. Let's go for our third. That's all set, and then our final wire here. Okay, it looks good. So there we have our spaghetti wiring here. Everything's soldered together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tape these up. Now I could use shrink wrap. Black tape's going to be good enough. Like I said, I'm going to be tucking this off on this side of the machine, so it's not going to be grounding out on anything. All the wires are soldered good. We're going to make sure we tape them up good. We'll put the power cord fits into here. We'll pop the machine together. Like I said, I might just leave the top here. We got the top of it here. I just might leave the top loose so I can remove the top and clean out, or I could manually, like I said, reverse the motor if something got stuck in there. The other option would be to go ahead and wire it to where the motor would go in reverse, but that would require probably a separate circuit, because you can't have another switch here and the motor's going one way and then you hit this switch and the motor, it's going to be it's not going to work. So it would have to be separated. There are things you can do for that, but we're not going to get into that right now. So let's go ahead and pop this thing back together and see if we can't shred some paper. Okay, so we have our shredder put back together. It sits on the top, and underneath here, inside the bin, there's 4 posts and 4 nuts that hold it on. And got the bin in there. Not a bad machine for free. Let's turn it on and shred some stuff. See what happens. I'll try a thicker stack here. For good measure, we'll shred a CD. Okay, check the bin. You can see it's all finely shredded. It's actually a little bit better than my other shredder. It doesn't shred very fine. You could see how fine. You could see the pieces of CD in there. It just absolutely destroyed the CD. So I think that's a go. Got another trash find that we've been able to bring back to life, albeit we had to do some trickery with some of the wiring, but it would have otherwise been garbage, and we would have had to put money into it for that control board, which was burned out. But we don't need all the fancy features. I didn't need the power button here because I'm turning on the power in the back, so I'm using that existing switch. So I hope you enjoyed the video. It's a model SPL-TXC18A, and I hope to find more treasures in the trash and bring them back to life. So it's Friday the 13th today. Yesterday was garbage day. I missed that, so I'll probably be out next week, looking for some more treasures. So thanks for watching. Hit like, and if you want to receive more videos, subscribe. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you learned something. And you can do it yourself. You can make it work. So don't throw it away. And we'll see you next time.